So I'm conscious that it's 4 o'clock, and you've probably heard about big data for hours today. So this is a pretty light session, so that's the good news. It's not, there's no deep dive thinking required here. So I'm going to have to look at the screen here without my walk-around mic. Just in terms of agenda, I'm going to talk about big data definition firstly. Again, I guess you've had a couple of definitions today on, what is it? And I think the answer is everybody has a different answer about what big data is. I'll talk about the big data landscape and the organizations that are involved in big data, because there's so many different technologies and so many different companies. So I'll just touch on those, and particularly how we see it in Jaspersoft, because the difference I would say this year to, let's say, last year is there are many, many companies now using big data or exploiting big data compared to what there were before. So there is a landscape emerging where people are gaining real benefit from it and making the data work. There was a guy actually said about 2 weeks ago, somebody I met from a big storage company, and his pitch was quite interesting. He said, well, you're paying for it, so you might as well get use for it. And it was an interesting way of thinking of it. If you've got an organization with a lot of data, then while storage costs have come down a lot, it's still expensive, right? So there's not much point in just holding it if you're not going to try to at least begin to explore it and see can you get tangible benefit from it. The use cases is the third piece, and pretty much I think it's the area that we get asked most about, which is, well, I don't really know about big data. I don't really know what I should be doing. So can you give me some examples of where it's being used and how it's been exploited profitably for your organization? So I'll just touch on a couple of those. And the interesting thing is it spans every sector you can imagine, and probably more that I haven't got on the slide. I'll finish up by just sort of explaining Jaspersoft then, as in what we do, and particularly what we do in the context of big data. And I'll summarize it in one slide, which is probably a kind of a call to action in many ways. So this is the big data definition. The first one I find kind of funny because, you think of the sort of analyst groups and people like Gartner and, IDC and Forrester and all these people. And there's usually a really technical, well-defined statement on something. And I think that this statement about, from Doug Laney was quite interesting about what's big data. It's an order of magnitude greater than you're accustomed to. Well, it's okay, but it doesn't really tell you much. I think the point here is, there is no real definition of it in that sense. So lots of people are calling it lots of different things. The one thing we do know is, at the bottom here, we're hearing these 3 Vs. In fact, I've heard 4 and 5 Vs, but they're probably the important things to know. If you've got a volume of data, particularly particular velocity of data, and a variety of data, you've probably got big data. So, the 3 Vs are something I would watch for. This is a slide full of text, right? But it kind of has to be, because it sort of explains, I guess, the big data landscape. And if you notice back in the main session room, you'll see a lot of these companies out there. So I would describe big data, in my opinion at the moment, as being a very early stage, in that there are so many different companies that are trying to capture little pieces of it, or trying to answer little pieces of the problem. And in many ways, they're all different. But you will definitely see more consolidation here. And it might not necessarily be that the best companies win, but the companies that manage to crack this and become profitable and become, more used than others are likely to be the ones that you'll see for time to come. We work with quite a few of these people in various organizations around the world, and I'll touch on a couple. So presumably everybody here has heard of Hadoop. Anybody here has not heard of Hadoop? Okay, well that's a good start, right? The title of my presentation had the open source piece in it, and it's kind of interesting because Hadoop is open source, and a lot of innovation, as you know, comes from the open source world. So Jaspersoft being open source, we've been working with Hadoop for a long, long time. long before it became a kind of household name or a name that everybody would understand. So at an engineering and technical level, the organizations have worked with each other for a long time just to understand how this stuff works. The companies that we're seeing more in the mainstream now, and some of the ones on the slides here, for example, there's 10gen who have MongoDB. Has anybody heard of MongoDB? Right, so that's pretty impressive that quite a few people have. I bet even last year, people may not have heard of that company. There's a slide I'll show you in a couple of minutes, but we work with Ericsson on reporting and analysis with MongoDB as their back-end big data store. The other one that's quite prominent in that sort of area, if you like, is Cassandra from DataStax. And sometimes we see that people tend to use one or the other, or they seem to say it's one or the other. I think their technologies there are similarities, but there are also some differences, and they play, it's like they're the two big guys fighting it out in that particular area. Out of interest, has anybody heard of Cassandra? All right, so even more. That is very interesting. I think the area that came to prominence more, or certainly more quickly than, let's say, the NoSQL type arena would be the analytical databases, or the MPP area. So the list you see here on the analytical relational side, a lot of these companies used to be individual companies, but when you read through and you realize that pretty much every one of them have been taken over by a large organization, then you realize that there's something going on here, because they don't buy these big companies unless they realize that there's some monetary value, or they're getting into a marketplace which is pretty big. I mean, you see Vertica outside here, who are obviously owned by HP. Greenplum were taken over by EMC. Netezza were taken over by IBM. Not sure the rest. VectorWise is owned by Actian. So it's interesting. It just shows the consolidation that you can see in this landscape. And I think that will continue. I think you'll probably see less of those vendors, but more of them will come to prominence. This slide it's aimed really, I suppose, at kind of giving you a view of Jaspersoft's world of data. So people, come to us and say, listen, we want to report on our data, or we want to analyze our data. And we typically start by saying, well, what data sources have you got? And for a long time, it was the relational data stores. So, the Oracle, the SQL Server, DB2, these kind of guys. And that market consolidated a long time ago, as we all know. And Oracle just buy everybody, so you may end up under their banner at some stage. But the thing that's emerged, in a big way in the last couple of 18 months or so is the big data area, and that's very crowded. So it's the same companies pretty much that we had on earlier. So what has Jaspersoft done? Well, knowing that this area, customers are asking for it, you have to be able to work with it. And Jaspersoft's been probably one of the most prominent companies, if not the earliest, to work directly with each of these guys. And I'll come through in a couple of minutes just to show you what we mean by that. But the partnerships we have now are very, very strong in the big data source area, if you like. It's interesting as well because files and spreadsheets and stuff have not gone away, and there's relational data, there's big data, and then there's a lot of this other unstructured type stuff. It's not to be forgotten, and you've got to be able to report and work with this stuff as well. So, just interesting. If you were to photograph a slide or take away one slide from today's session, I'd probably do this one. So it's really about the three approaches to big data. And Jaspersoft's unique here in that we can do all of these three. There's not any, I don't believe there's any other BI organization that can do this. It's a pretty big slide, so I'm going to kind of read through it just to give you a sample of what you can do with big data right now using Jaspersoft. So the first piece really is data exploration. And data exploration is, we call them data scientists, right, this new word, or people who are trying to get a sense of what's going on with real-time data and huge data in that sense. What's interesting is it's low latency. So the kind of technologies you're going to be working with here are listed. It's going to be H-based, NoSQL, and analytical databases. And if you look down at the kind of pictorial piece here, the one thing to note, I suppose, is you're not looking at a cube, so you're not using an ETL type technology. You're hooking directly into the data to explore. And that's quite interesting because some people are worried about the barriers, or how can I start getting into big data? Well, right now with Jaspersoft, you can hook directly into your source and play around with the data to an extent. Just start looking for trends on live data, and that's pretty powerful. The second piece is on the operational side. It's more, I suppose, a management type view. So you're now getting into more of a structure, right? So, management directors, etc., are looking for their KPIs or their dashboard, which is an amalgamation of the information they want to suck out of their big data sources. So typically in this sense, you're looking at kind of more medium latency, and you're looking at things like Hive. So Hive, if anybody is familiar with it, show of hands again. That's great. It's a lot of people are well educated on this. So it's putting more structure to the unstructured. It's probably just the kind of simplest way of putting this. And again, you're looking at probably reports and dashboards into your BI platform, reporting off native or SQL into your data source. The third piece then is in many ways what lots of people can do, and the difference here is you're doing analysis, kind of deeper dive analysis on the information you have, and the big difference is ETL. So you've got to move your data in this sense from your sources into something else using your ETL tools and technologies, and then you're doing your reporting and analysis on it. So takeaway I'd say from this slide is just remember, you don't have to immediately go down the ETL route. There are certainly reasons for it and places for it. If you're at the early stages and looking at getting into big data, you can do it without ETL. So you can connect to your sources and explore. It's not for everything, but it is an option that some people should, I think, perhaps consider. This is another interesting slide. Apologies for all the text. There's kind of no other way of getting it across. The use cases, we're always asked about it, and there's no sector that's really untouched by big data. So the ones that are probably more exciting, I suppose, are areas like healthcare. So people are wondering, with the vast amounts of data out there, surely there will be some amazing discoveries made based on years of data and petabytes of information that's out there. There's kind of some unique, nearly niche ones that we've come across recently, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. One is in online retail, another is a online game company, and there are many, many more. But the point I think of this slide is that there's nowhere that's, let's say, untouched from a sector perspective with big data. It's really up to organizations to understand what big data means to them and how they can exploit it, so where they can get their information from. And I think that's quite interesting. The next slide is a different sort of take on it. So we hear a huge amount about machine-generated data, and I was at a conference just 2 weeks ago where the guy from Oracle actually said that the level of machine-generated data is exploding exponentially at this point. And I guess when you think about mobile and devices and things like that, you can kind of get an understanding of, we're not now locked to our desks anymore. Information is not just generated from applications. There are whole piles of data coming from machines effectively that is now being exploited, and it's probably only with big data technologies that you can start harnessing some of this stuff. Unstructured is probably another word that I would say is, if you can capture the unstructured data and do something with it, then you've got it made. And I think that's what big data is probably all about. This is an interesting sample use case from a telco. I'm going to build out the slide first. So this is a customer in the US, and I think you could almost describe this as a trial to some extent. So what they decided to do was understand if they offered a pay-per-view service, would it cannibalize their business from their standard monthly plan? This is on mobile. And without, previous technologies would not have allowed them to be able to do this. But by capturing all the log information, they were able to understand and figure out exactly what happened. The interesting thing was the answer was yes, right? So it did cannibalize, and it was a less profitable situation than it would have been previously. So you might say, well, that wasn't a great idea. But I think the learning from it is this telco now understood. So, this is a classic example of being able to exploit big data, in a pretty much live environment and look at it and understand it and report back immediately saying, hey, not a good idea to launch this service because it's cannibalizing another service we have. So it's an interesting example. So how can Jaspersoft help in your big data strategy? I'll talk about customers because I think it's the simplest way of explaining just a couple of stories as to what people are doing so that you get a sense of it. So has anybody here heard of Groupon? Right? Quite a lot of people. So Groupon are, online retail. They're the guys that offer, all these offers. I think they're in my spam filter at this point. I get so many things that come through. But the interesting thing about these guys is they have 80 million subscribers. And what they do with Jaspersoft, they have just a massive expanding Hadoop cluster. And they look at Jaspersoft pretty much live, probably every couple of seconds or every couple of minutes, to understand the revenue that they're generating through Facebook advertising. And at the same time, the costs for those ads on Facebook. So that's pretty huge data in a live context. And they can make decisions on the fly based on that. I sort of describe Groupon sometimes. They're a little bit like, like a Ladbrokes or these kind of bookies type things where if everybody puts money on a horse, then they change the odds. And it's a bit like that with these guys in terms of the offers, right? So good value on something. If somebody's putting, buying up all these things, and they're going to change the prices accordingly. So being able to do that in a live fashion is really exploiting big data in a really, really clever way. The second one is Jagex. Not even on my slide here. I'm going to talk about it anyway. It's a company called Jagex. I guess nobody has heard of that company, right? About 500 people based in Oxford. They're absolutely huge in online gaming. Has anybody heard of Transformers? Transformer toys, I certainly remember them at one point. They have an online game version of this, and they have another game called RuneScape, I believe it's called. A lot of people probably know the game more so than the name of the company. These guys are fascinating. They have 150 petabytes of data in their Hadoop cluster. Now, that's pretty enormous. So what do they do with it? They try to understand the subscribers to their games, what they're doing literally in terms of the game, the way they play it, and the experience they're getting from it. And then they look at it from a marketing perspective to say, well, we're having a fall off here in a particular game. Why is that in a particular country? What's the payment method for this? Why are we getting cancellations? If we do a marketing campaign, why are we getting an uptake in a certain area? And they're changing, literally their advertising and how their whole sort of business approach goes on the fly. It's incredible to see. The amount of data that they're using is just, phenomenal. And their architecture is changing as we speak because they need to exploit Hadoop in a sensible way as opposed to just leaving it build and build. So they're an interesting company to watch. I won't go through the other slides or the other guys here, but Ericsson is one that's not on this also. These are the guys I mentioned earlier that are using Jaspersoft on MongoDB. I had a little sort of architecture slide earlier, and I'm going to do this one. If you wanted to understand what Jaspersoft do, it's probably a good snapshot. And if I talk from the bottom up, basically organizations have data right today. I have two choices with Jaspersoft. You can plug directly into it, which is this database here on my left, or you can use some form of ETL to populate another source, right? Be a data mart or data warehouse or whatever it might be. The pieces in the middle are what Jaspersoft do well, which is reporting, analysis, dashboards, etc. And the pieces on top are really the outputs. All right, so whether it's a production-looking report or an online dashboard or a drillable chart, that's really what we do in a nutshell. And it's really what business intelligence is. It's taking the information from your data sources, structuring it if you wish, not structuring it if you wish, but presenting it back in a meaningful form so that you can make decisions. So I thought a pictorial is better for explaining that one. These are the partnerships. I won't go through again in any major detail because we've spoken about them already, but it's an emerging landscape, and I think it'll continue to consolidate. This is, again, a key takeaway. I mentioned it earlier that Jaspersoft is unique in that we have 3 approaches to big data. Most companies have 1, maybe 2. I think being able to connect directly without ETL is an advantage, particularly in the early days if you want to get up and running with your big data. Start exploring. There aren't barriers in that sense to investing in other technologies and worrying about moving huge, vast amounts of data to some other source. The partnerships and the organizations we've worked with, I think it probably just goes back to what I would describe as our open source community type sense of how the company works. And obviously, Hadoop and those being open source has given us probably an unfair advantage to some extent on big data and some of the emerging technologies there. Again, I won't bore you with this one, but it's a little bit repetitive. It's kind of a view of Jaspersoft working with data in 3 different ways. So summary, I think we're at the time is up. It's just one slide. I would certainly say, because we get asked all the time, what is big data? And we started with what's the definition of big data. I think understand what big data means to you, to your organization. You are unique. You'll know your data sources better than anybody. So just get a sense of what does that mean to you. It might be, and I don't joke, it might be 1 terabyte for one organization. It might be 100 petabytes for somebody else. But understand what it means for you. Know where you are today. And I think, start brainstorming a little bit and trying to understand what questions should we be asking, what data should we be trying to exploit, or put it another way, if you've got a direct competitor that does the same as you, are they doing something about it, or are they just saying big data is just a new phase, nobody's actually doing anything, everybody's talking about it. I think there's certain things you can do and you can begin exploring pretty quickly. Connect directly. I've probably said that about 10 times already. I think it's something you should try. Start beginning with it. The barriers are not there. And start to explore. I think you can develop your strategies once you've played around with it to an extent. Not doing it is probably the worst phase, and we see a lot of people at the moment talking about it but not actually playing with their data. And I think it's something you should look at. And that's it. Ask for help. There's a lot of companies out there, so don't be shy. If you want to talk to Jaspersoft at any stage and get our view on it, we're certainly happy to help. And I think there's no shortage of resources out there. And with that, I say thank you.